From AATH, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor, this is Laughbox, the podcast for laughter and humor professionals. Here's your host, Chip Lutz.
Well, hello, friends, and welcome to Laughbox, the official podcast for the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. This week, I get to talk to Patty Wooten. Patty Wooten, I kind of look at her as kind of like the godmother of AATH. She's been around since the beginning, before even AATH was around, and it was, I think, a different organization. I think Nursing Jocularity. Maybe I'm right on that. I don't know exactly, but I know that she, used to plan all the conferences, was president, is a Lifetime Achievement Award winner. She's a nurse. She's a humorist. She's a speaker. She's a hospital clown. She just does it all. I mean, she spreads joy wherever she goes. Just a fantastic person, and I'm so excited that I get to talk to her today. So welcome, Patty, to Laughbox.
Thank you, Chip. It's good to be here.
Well, the pleasure is absolutely mine. I mean, I tell you, I remember the first conference I went to, and I saw you at the airport, and I was like, hey, that's Patty Wooten. I was all excited. So so now all my dreams could have come true, and I get to, spend a little more intimate time with you, talking about things. And so, I know we're going to talk about, looking at humor and dealing with different disasters. But, for those of us, those of the listeners that don't know you all that well, if you could kind of give them just the brief background on Patty Wooten, nurse extraordinaire.
Well, thank you. A legend in my own mind, perhaps. Let's see. My professional career has been nursing for about 44 years. And after I was a nurse for about 5 years, I went through a bunch of personal tragedies and challenges and was really quite depressed and couldn't seem to get out of it. So I went to clown school, which is not a person's first choice, but I lived in California, and so we had a lot of choices at the time. So I trotted off to clown school thinking maybe this will help me get out of the depression. And what I found was that by hiding behind the clown mask and acting as if life was fun and funny, my internal experience of the world began to shift. My belief in myself and potential began to shift, and I gradually came out of the depression, and incredibly grateful for that opportunity. And so I then began wanting to help others understand how important humor and laughter and play could be for, emotional challenges or just life quality. So I began to teach nurses about how they could use humor to cope with the stress in the job, and perhaps even use humor at the bedside to help people experience their recovery a little more easily. Mm-hmm. And then along the way, I started giving speeches and wrote some books and taught clown classes. And then we came upon AATH, which began actually out of that small nurses group. There was about 13 nurses after a laughter and play conference. 13 nurses got together, and Allison Crane actually put a little notice up on a bulletin board and says, "Nurses interested in laughter, meet here at lunch." And there were 13 of us, and we started Nurses for Laughter and a little newsletter, and we began sharing our thoughts and ideas. And then about a year after that, somebody said, well, look, we should expand this to include more than just nurses. What about social workers? What about physicians? What about teachers? And so that's when we decided to expand the scope and called it therapeutic humor. So that's kind of how that evolved.
How cool is that? That's just a notice on a bulletin board. It's like, hey, anybody interested in laughter, let's meet here. And just is amazing that, the organization has been around 30 plus years, and it all started with, a note on a bulletin board.
Exactly.
That is pretty neat.
The environment was ripe. I mean, Norman Cousins' book had come out just a few years before. Bill Fry was from Stanford, physician professor at Stanford, was starting to write about psychological benefits of humor. And the humor movement was just beginning back then. So we were just one more piece to the puzzle.
That's pretty neat. Pretty cool stuff. Now I know that today we're looking at humor and disaster, and we certainly have had a lot of stuff going on recently. Hurricanes, just some earthquakes down in Mexico, just a lot of crazy natural disasters going on there. And for me, thinking about disasters, I haven't had to undergo anything like that, but I've had disasters in my own life. But thinking about laughing during the middle of a disaster, I mean, is that something that's really possible for people?
It is possible, and we know that it happens actually quite frequently. There's writings from the times of the Holocaust in concentration camps where laughter was used to cope. From the Vietnam War, POWs that used laughter over many, many years while they were imprisoned to help them cope and keep their psychological stability. And a variety of disasters, whether, like the earthquake in San Francisco or the flooding in the Midwest or hurricanes and tornadoes down in Texas. Yeah, there's a lot of history of humor and laughter being used to cope with the shock.
Well, why does it help us cope?
Well, I think one of the first things it does is it gives us a relief for the tension.
Mm-hmm.
You can laugh or you can cry. And then Victor Borge says, I prefer laughing. There's less mopping up to do afterwards.
True statements. And I assume that it's like it got to be like an element of control in there as well. Is that you can't control that situation, you can't control what's happened, but you can control how you are reacting to the situation. Certainly, crying about it or laughing about it. Laughter gives you a little bit more, I don't know, more of a power stance than crying. Crying to me, what you feel is what you feel. However, for me, laughing at a situation puts me a little bit more in a power position.
It does. It gives you perceptual control. It gives you an attitudinal control, and it influences others around you. I mean, I love that quote from Shakespeare. I think it was Hamlet. And he says, nothing is either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
Thinking, yeah, when we sit around and ruminate about things, thinking sometimes I can be my own worst enemy on, making it through something. If I sit back and I think about it wrong.
Yeah, or get into the pity pot of, oh, poor me.
Yeah, exactly. So I think we kind of hit on the why. Why else do people laugh during situations like natural disasters or even man-made disasters?
Well, it gives us some control, like we were talking, the perceptual control. I can look at it this way and that feels better.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives us some emotional distancing from the crisis and like I said, a feeling of control. And it helps us connect with others to feel like we're not the only ones in this. We are a community that shares in this experience.
Interesting. It reminds me of, I had the opportunity to interview Father John Noss. He was a priest up at Marquette University. And when we were talking, he equated humor and laughter to being like a helicopter that can lift us up over our issues, so we can get a perspective. So when you said that it can distance us a little bit, that's what came to mind for me as far as thinking about, having that perspective, that emotional distance.
Yeah, to rise above. Yeah, what is it that I forget who said it? We use our levity to rise above the gravity or gravity of the situation. So
you worked hard to make those rhyme. That was awesome. That was great. Levity and gravity, yes, or lavity and gravity. Make them rhyme. Things always work better when they rhyme. That's just me. Now, historically, how do people, how have they used humor, historically, to handle difficult situations?
Well, like I said, we see it in many, many different situations, as probably historically back to the beginning of time. But it provides us some distancing from the crisis. When you're in the middle of the crisis, you feel like you are damaged and you are struggling. And So when we laugh at it, we again detach and we sort of master our anxiety. There's a little game we play, I think, in our head. Say, it's not bothering me. Look, I'm laughing about it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when Ed Dunkelblau, also a AATH member, past president and a Lifetime Achievement Award winner, he and I went down to New Orleans about 6 months after Katrina.
Mm-hmm.
We were asked to come down there to speak to not only the community but also to the hospital staff to help them try to get through and understand their reactions to the experience. And there was one point I think Ed said, is there anybody out here who can tell us about something funny that happened, but you didn't know it was funny until afterwards?
Mm-hmm.
And there was this little lady raised her hand and she says, well, I remember when they came to rescue me in the boat and they carried me out to the boat. And I said to the man, please go get my little dog. My little dog is in there. He's going to die. So the man went back into the flooded house and found the little dog and came back out and said to the lady, you know, your dog nearly died. When I went in there, he was swimming and swimming and swimming. And, you know, he was so exhausted, he could have just climbed up and gotten on the couch, which was above the water. And she says, I looked at that man and I said, I have told my dog 1,000 times not to get up on the couch.
That's funny.
But it became funny afterwards, but at the time she didn't realize, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You know, they say that tragedy plus time equals comedy. So it's sometimes we don't know till afterwards. I know that after 9/11, I was serving, well, before and during and after 9/11, 2001. I mean, I was serving in DC, and I was in charge of a security organization, and so it was really, really busy. But you know, afterwards, I mean, that was obviously a man-induced disaster, and we were only 4 miles away from the Pentagon, and it was really, really stressful. But we coped a lot that week and afterwards with just simple things, and some of it was kind of dark, but that was the thing that kind of helped us, through the process of getting through things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
All right. Very, very interesting. I love that story, and I love the fact that you did a voice for it too, because as soon as you started the voice, I started laughing. The voice was just funny to me. The story was great, but the voice was awesome as well. Now thinking about that, that sometimes we don't know until later. I mean, how soon can that perspective shift for us, or how soon can the laughter occur, or how can people speed it up for themselves?
Well, it depends on how involved you are in or how close you are to the actual disaster crisis. Because at the very beginning, if you're at ground zero, so to speak, no matter what the disaster is, you feel very involved. You feel physically threatened, certainly emotionally threatened, and it's almost impossible to laugh at that time because you don't feel safe. And so it takes a little time until you feel like, you're down off of that roof, or the water has stopped coming at you, or there's a sense of stability, and then you're able to perhaps again laugh. And what we know is the more that you're affected by the disaster, the harder it is to laugh. So let's say in a flood, the person that believes or sees that they've lost everything in their house and the potential for the future, and there's no hope for recovery, that person will have a harder time or a more delayed sense of being able to laugh than the person who loses the same amount but has a sense of hope that, okay, I have some financial resources, I have some insurance, I have some possibility of getting back to where I was. Mm-hmm. So it's about the amount of the impact.
So do you think that, because you mentioned prior that historically, even in the POW camps in the Hanoi Hilton and stuff, that, people have used humor and laughter to kind of cope with things. Do you think it's just inherent to our human nature that, laughter always finds a way, that it always finds a way to rear its ugly head? Even because, like you just said, there are some things that just plain aren't funny, they just aren't, they are not funny at the time. Whether it's, I think about, I was in the hospital earlier this year, and I had a perforated bowel, and the pain was excruciating. And there wasn't much funny during all that. Now, evidently, I'm super hilarious when I come out of anesthesia. So, but I wasn't in any pain at that time. But that, do you think that it always just, eventually finds a way for us? It just, sometimes we have to wait it out.
I think time is a factor. I think culture plays another huge influence in terms of whether your culture that you've lived and grown up with is, if it's natural to that culture and it's allowed and expected, etc. If you think of the Jewish culture and history, they've always created humor in different situations. And Viktor Frankl writes about it in the Holocaust. Steve Lippman wrote a book called Laughter in Hell. And he's a psychologist that looked at how much humor and laughter was used during the World War II, and again, in the concentration camps. So I think culture plays a difference with it. We know that the more physical distance you have from the disaster, the quicker your laughter comes back. For example, think of 9/11. Those in the New York or Washington areas that were physically experiencing the horror and the fallout from that immediate horror, it was harder for them to laugh than, say, in California. I mean, none of us laughed for a while, but we weren't as impacted because we didn't have the visceral experience of the sights and smells and perhaps friends that were lost in that experience.
That's an interesting distinction, that, even with the hurricanes that went through, that there were things that were popping up on my social media feed that were hurricane related, humor hurricane related, but they weren't always posted by people that were in that area. So, obviously you had that, those people had that physical distance. And I started thinking that, if I was in that vicinity and I knew that danger was imminent and things were going on, would I think this is as funny as I do because I live in Wisconsin and we don't have hurricanes up here?
Yeah, precisely. Well,
Interesting.
Another member of AATH, Sandy Ritz, a woman who got her doctorate degree in public health, a nurse also, she wrote her doctoral thesis on the recovery that Hawaii experienced after Hurricane Iniki in, I think, 1992 or somewhere around there. And she described a series of disaster recovery phases and matched them up with how humor changed during those different recovery phases. Like the first stage of any disaster recovery is the heroic phase. And, we certainly saw that in Houston with the Cajun Navy that came in and the multi-ethnic people that were rescuing people of other colors and races. And it was a real unifying, actually right after Charlottesville experience. So during that heroic phase, people really come together and the laughter is really shared. But then as the situation evolves, then there's a distinction between those who come in to help, who haven't experienced the loss as much, and those who are still in the middle of the loss. And then that's when the humor begins to shift and isn't shared quite as much.
So are you saying that there's a difference in the humor that's used by survivors versus like the rescue workers?
Yes, absolutely. At first there's a laughing with, where they're laughing together about equally struggling through whatever the challenge is. And then as and she actually defined it as called the honeymoon phase, which happens about a week to a few months after the disaster, that there's still some optimism about, I have insurance, or FEMA's going to help, or whatever. And then as it gets further and the recovery is not as successful as they hoped, then they go into what's called the disillusionment phase, where well, my insurance isn't going to pay anything, and we're not going to get our electricity back. And so there's a real time recovery thing. And of course, the disaster workers go back home at some point.
Right.
And so, they have, again, that physical distance from that experience.
Interesting. So it's almost kind of like the different stages of grief. There's different stages of humor as we're going through a disastrous thing.
Yeah. I mean, she calls it the honeymoon, the heroic phase, the honeymoon phase, the disillusionment phase, and then finally the reconstruction phase, which can happen a year, 6 months to a year afterwards, where the rebuilding is actually occurring and the huge shifts.
How interesting is that? That I'd never really thought about a cycle like that. And so in my mind, I'm just like kind of blown away that, wow, that does make, quite a bit of sense in, looking at a disaster like that. So, very interesting. Did she have it like drawn out? Was it like a cool model like that? Because that's what I would have done. That's what I would have done. Oh.
Yeah, she has this grid kind of a thing and talks about the different phases and how the humor shifts between survivors and disaster workers.
Oh, so you said that she had a book? Or is that
it's a doctoral thesis, so I'm sure it's published somewhere, but yeah.
Oh, I'm gonna have to look that up. And what was the other book that you said? Was it Humor in Hell or Laughter in Hell? Because I want to make sure.
Hell by Steve Lipman.
Yeah, I'll make sure I get that one too, because I'd never heard of that. I mean, obviously, I've read, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, and he talks about how humor, helps people cope a little bit. But I'd never heard of that book, so that's something I'm going to put on my list to get. I'm always looking for other things to feed my brain a little bit, expand my brain, because I'm not near as smart as you. So I have to work at it a little bit harder.
Well, actually, you remember. The first AATH conference after 9/11, it was only like 2 months after 9/11 or 3 months after 9/11, we had our AATH conference in Baltimore.
No, that was before me. I don't remember that one.
Oh, okay. Well, so Ed and I had been putting on conferences, and here's the 3-day humor and laughter conference and all this. And it's all about, finding your laughing place and releasing and fun. But yet here we were 2 to 3 months just outside of 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't just start a conference without mentioning 9/11, without integrating how humor can be a tool for recovery, how humor was used. And what reminded me of this was Steve Lipman, the man who wrote Laughter in Hell. We invited him to come as a speaker. Oh,
wow.
As one of the experts on how do you laugh in the face of horrible situations.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but we had the chance to then take a look at some of the humor that was used immediately after 9/11. Like I said, for a few weeks, there wasn't any at all. And all eyes were on New York City. It was like, we can't laugh until we know they're okay with laughter.
Mm-hmm.
And even some of the, the late night comedy shows and Saturday Night Live all had a kind of somber presence on stage. And then you began to see a little bit of humor here and there, the Saturday Night Live with Giuliani on stage, and Jay Leno and David Letterman, and all of them saying, I know that spring is coming to New York because I was walking through Central Park and I saw all the squirrels collecting their Cipro, or stockpiling their Cipro,
mm-hmm.
for the anthrax thing. And some of the lines the comedians used when they stepped on stage, saying, well, I guess this takes the heat off the sharks, what they were laughing about before 9/11. Yeah. So I think the closer we are to the disaster and the closer the time is to the disaster, the harder it is. And we all not wanting to offend, take our cues from those closest to the disaster.
Right. Well, I mean, and that kind of brings me to like what I want to kind of hit on. You know, we looked at some of the things there, but as far as like practical application, if, you know, I've just gone through something like that, what are some things that I can do to try to, you know, help me rebound, you know, humor or laughter wise? What are some things, some practical applications?
Well, what we see humor and laughter coming back usually in an intimate setting, so it's usually with trusted friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
That's often where the humor will begin to start. And so I think that we need to look at what made us laugh before.
Okay.
Who were the comedians that made us laugh? Who were the cartoonists? What were the TV shows that made us laugh? And see if we can reconnect with that. Because historically we should be able to find that again. Laughing about the disaster may be more difficult than laughing at something completely apart from the disaster.
Okay.
Yeah, and there's a website that I like for all kinds of current events. It's called Cagle.com, Cagle.
Okay.
And he has, you know, all of the collected from around the world current event humor. So it can be political, it can be, you know, located on some things that are happening on the other side of the world, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. And I would make sure everybody knows how to spell that right. So you want to make sure that you look up Kegel.com and not Kegel.com, because I think you're going to get a much different result.
Exactly.
I'll have to check out that website too. So, you know, being around people, you know, and I think that's a great piece of advice on, you know, not isolating yourself. 'Cause sometimes when we go through something, we do tend to isolate ourselves, but being around and, you know, starting in that intimate setting and then, you know, moving on, and maybe you can't laugh at that disaster, but think about some of those things historically that made you laugh and reaching out and trying to like, just like fill yourself with some of those other things that might not be disaster specific. Those are great pieces of advice to, you know, help you move through the stages. What are some other things that have worked that you've seen?
Well, before I forget, I want to tell you about one cartoon I saw on the Kegel site earlier, and that was there was sort of this city skyline, and it was halfway filled up with water, and it said, "Houston, we have a problem," which, you know, was a bit of an understatement, but it helped it, you know, give it a little bit of a shift back to that. Apollo flight in the movie and all of that. So laughter among intimate friends, people that you've laughed with, trusted friends and family, that's one thing. Going back to what makes us laugh before. Other things, and again, you have to somehow get around the technical logistical thing. You're not going to be reading newspapers, you're going online until you have electricity and some kind of mobility. So some of those are limited. But just sharing stories with families about what used to be funny and what the fun things we used to share. Puppies and kittens, you know, those silly little things that they do. You see them on Facebook all the time.
Right.
You know, it's innocent. It's almost childlike and just playful, and it kind of renews your sense that life can be innocent.
Yeah, I don't know why cats are so funny. I mean, I really think that most cats, you know, they don't care about humans. They own the house, but they are just the things that people put up with cats on the internet are hilarious. I don't know what makes them so funny, but maybe it is that childlike thing and the absurdity of thinking of a cat doing certain things. Actually, I saw a meme where it gave the different categories of hurricanes, but it had cats in it. So it was like a cat 1. It showed a cat just kind of sitting there, all the way up to a cat 5, where cats were flying all over the place. And it was hilarious. But then again, I live in Wisconsin, so I was one of those things where, you know, I don't really have to deal with the actual Category 5 hurricane, but it was with cats, so it made me laugh.
And even funnier for a cat person. I tend to be more of a dog person, so, you know, I appreciate the dog sort of situations and humor.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, great advice. I mean, great practical applications and thinking about things historically on how humor and laughter have been used throughout the ages. Like you said, since the beginning of time for helping people get through things. I've had the opportunity to talk to a few people that, well, talked to a person that was a POW in the Hanoi Hilton, and, he did say that it was, humor that even reared its head there, that it was one of those things that after a while they had their own sense of humor of things that were funny and gave them kind of a power position over the overall situation. It was interesting to hear about the cycle as well, that I'd never thought about it in that, and I'm going to have to make sure that I look that up so I can get that visual on how things work when you're going through them, and realizing that there is hope at the ends, and humor can help us get there.
Exactly. And there's kind of two, I guess, the categories or genres. There's the person who can create the humor and stimulate the laughter, which is really a powerful skill to have.
Mm-hmm.
On the other side of the people that allow themselves to appreciate the laughter. And I remember reading in Gerald Coffey's book when he was a POW about how the soldiers that created the humor were recovered better, had much more stability after the POW experience. And that one story he told about some soldier scribbled on the wall or etched in the wall of the shower a little phrase, and he was taking a shower one day and he looked over and this little scratched message said, "Smile, you're on candid camera."
Right.
And how just the Viet Cong never knew anything about that, but how it just lifted everybody's spirits and allowed them to laugh a little.
That's pretty funny. Yeah, I read that in his book as well, and I thought that was hilarious. That humor always finds a way. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but it finds a way. Now, after today, if people want to find you, where do they go, Patty?
Well, I have a website, which is my name, and so that makes it pretty easy. That would be Patty with a Y, Patty, and my last name is Wooten, WOOTEN.com, so pattywooten.com. And I have some articles posted there and links to other places on the internet that are helpful in terms of understanding how humor and laughter can be therapeutic physically as well as emotionally.
Well, I certainly appreciate you spending time with me today, and I know that our listeners will get a lot out of the things that you shared with us today. Like I said, you're an icon to me. I appreciate you, and I appreciate the work that you do to try to bring joy to the world and heighten people's awareness how humor and laughter can help them in their everyday struggles and through getting through disasters as well. Thanks so much.
Oh, you're welcome, Chip. Thanks so much for including me.
No, it was my pleasure. I'll catch you on the flip side.
All righty. Take care.
This is Laughbox, the podcast for laughter and humor professionals. Laughbox is made possible by a grant from the National Speakers Foundation and is brought to you by AATH, the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor. Find out more at aath.org. Be sure to review Laughbox on iTunes. For show notes and more information about today's conversation, visit laughbox.aath.org.